As I headed out the door with my ballot, I was reminded of the courage of my grandmother on the front lines of the suffrage movement. I've listened to my grandmother's stories since I was a toddler. Those first tales were amazing ones about animals that lived on the Colorado ranch where she grew up. Other times, she told me about how, as a little girl, she would get herself into some mischief or another. I loved those stories best. She never got tired of telling them, and I never got tired of listening. Every story infused me with a sense of possibility. Jessie Haver Butler grew up in Pueblo, Colorado, on a large cattle ranch. Her early years were riddled with unthinkable tragedies. Jessie was 10 years old, the day she looked up into the face of Susan B. Anthony, who was touring the West, speaking about women's rights from the back of a wooden wagon. That was the day she found hope and purpose in her life, which was passed on to me. She knew at that moment that she would grow up to speak out for the rights of women. I am in awe of my grandmother that, against all odds, she attended Smith College and earned a degree in public speaking. She went on to become the first woman lobbyist at the Capitol in Washington, D.C., proudly carrying the torch that she had been handed by Susan B. Anthony that fateful day in Pueblo. I would have loved to be with her when she palled around with such women as Eleanor Roosevelt, Alice Paul, and Lady Astor. Jessie was one of the major players in the Equal Rights Amendment and minimum wage law for women. In 1920, she was instrumental in giving you, me, and all women the right to vote. My grandfather took Jessie to London when he was assigned to the American Embassy, where she met George Bernard Shaw. Shaw was so impressed with Jessie that he invited her to lecture with him throughout London. My mother was born during those years in England, right about the time Jessie and Hugh were presented at the court of St. James, where Jessie procured the only compliment given by the Queen that day for her dress. A gown that, unbeknownst to everyone present, she had purchased used at a consignment store. I followed my grandmother around and watched her from the back of the podium when she was 93 years old. She made several speeches in Hollywood with Gloria Steinem, Marlo Thomas, and Jane Fonda. Susan B. Anthony didn't know that she had given a young girl hope and purpose, which she in turn gave to me, a legacy of courage and hope and possibility with each vote I make.
Flames flicker, letters burn. A life all about the written word disappears into soot and ash. We are left trying to understand a person and her understanding of her time through the books that survive her. In 1817, Jane Austen's novels were printed in her own name for the first time. She had died only weeks before. Her previous novels had all been published under the pseudonym By a Lady. Jane's brother and sister had worked to give her the place in literary history they knew she deserved. And it's thanks to their efforts that her work, previously anonymous, proudly bears the Austen name. It's because of them that we know who Jane Austen is. But it's also due to them that we don't know enough. But here are some of the things we do know. First, she was born into a large and colorful family. Her father was an orphan who worked his way out of poverty, and her mother descended from aristocracy, though they struggled to make ends meet. She had an aunt who traveled to India to marry, a cousin who lost her French husband to the guillotine, and her many siblings were, among other things, ship captains, militiamen, and clergy. She spent a little time at school, but was sent home after she and her sister caught typhus. The rest of her education came from books. First, her brother's school books, and when they ran out, whatever she could find in her father's library. At an early age, she started writing plays that the family performed together, often bawdy comedies. And encouraged by her parents, she developed the uniquely realistic, witty style that would be the hallmark of her future novels. Austen also honed her skills as a prolific letter writer. She's known to have written thousands in her lifetime, but sadly, her family burned or redacted almost all of them after her death. And we don't really know why. Scholars theorize it was in an effort to maintain Austen's positive image. After all, we know from her novels Austen was extremely harsh in her sarcasm and criticism, and they probably contained unflattering material about friends and acquaintances. But ironically, it appears her sister burned the letters to cover up the same blemishes and human traits Austen exposed in her writing. But whatever the reason, this destruction ensured that we have to look to Austen's novels for a glimpse of her internal life. And while from the outside, Austen's life may seem fairly straightforward and quiet, her novels reveal that she had a uniquely rich, insightful mind that made her a gifted writer and social commentator. And there was a lot worth commenting on. Austen was born just months before the United States declared independence, jump-starting an age of revolution. As Austen's family were putting on plays and attending dances, Paris experienced the fall of the Bastille and the terror of the guillotine. Her family was not entirely insulated from politics. One of her brothers joined the Navy, while another took the grand tour of Europe. But, as a woman, Austen's life consisted of writing, dancing, and gossip. And there, she saw the hypocrisy of it. She saw the hypocrisy of an entire class of the most powerful empire on earth taking tea and planning balls while the world burned. And from a young age, she took up arms against that hypocrisy with the only weapon she had, her pen. Slavery, poverty, feminism, marriage, the church, the aristocracy, all were fair game to her. In an age where certain topics were papered over or simply not discussed, she saw the need to talk about them as they really were. And women at the time couldn't really write about that. Not only in a literal sense, women couldn't legally sign contracts for themselves, but also culturally. Publishing a serious book under Austen's name would have been social suicide. Women weren't supposed to have strong opinions. And so, Austen mastered the arts of satire, sarcasm, and subtext. She used humor to grapple with serious subjects in a realistic way, in a contemporary world that looked like her own. In doing so, she helped invent literary realism. This was extraordinary. At that time, the government could seriously punish critics, and most contemporary writers, like Sir Horace Walpole for instance, responded by writing sentimental novels about the past. Austen, on the other hand, wrote books set in the present, critiquing issues of the day. So, what did she write about? 1813, Pride and Prejudice. For years, Austen had been working on a book. It won't be her first published novel, but it will be her first fully mature work, and her first success. In the wake of political upheaval, the French Revolution, and the insanity of English King George III, Austen took aim at a genteel class that wasn't changing with the times. Pride and Prejudice opens with Austen's traditional sarcastic wit. It is a truth, universally acknowledged, that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. In that awesome line, she lets loose on everything she sees wrong with society: money, marriage, and social mobility. Marriage was still an economic proposition amongst England's middle and upper class. You married for title or for money, and it was a negotiation, not a romance, a way to amass wealth and titles. But in Pride and Prejudice, Austen champions marrying for love, regardless of social barrier. But it wasn't just that. In the novel, Austen examines the one real choice most women got to make in their lives: who they would marry. In a world where women couldn't inherit property and were forced to become dependent on a husband, Austen showed the life and death stakes of parlor conversations and evening soirees. A world where comfort or poverty could turn on a riding lesson or afternoon tea. But Austen saw that amassing wealth couldn't be the only goal in life. In fact, she herself practiced what she preached. Austen never married, and even broke off a promising engagement because the match was only for family advantage. Anything, she wrote in a surviving letter, is to be preferred or endured rather than marrying without affection. 1814. Mansfield Park. In 1807, England abolished selling enslaved people within its empire, but it did not abolish slavery itself. An untold number of people were still in bondage in British colonies, if not actually on the soil of England itself. But in 1814, slavery was still a controversial issue in England. Many colonies, especially in the Caribbean, profited greatly off slave labor, and a great deal of the wealth and luxury items those colonies created, like sugar, flowed right back to the United Kingdom. Indeed, even abolitionists among Austen's social class drank their tea with Barbados sugar, but it wasn't something novels ever talked about. Austen considered slavery repulsive, and in 1814 she published a book that subtly criticized England's complicity. But she had to do so indirectly, through metaphor and small hints. The estate in her novel, Mansfield Park, takes its name from Judge Mansfield, who in 1772 decided the first case ruling slavery illegal in England. In the novel, a young girl goes to live with her aunt and uncle, whose lavish lifestyle comes from a Caribbean sugar plantation. But when the protagonist asks the head of the house about the slave trade, he responds with uncomfortable silence. However, Austen's opinion of him is metaphorically clear. He treats people as objects to be moved and traded. Now, it's not as strong an indictment as it could be, especially to a modern eye, but at a time when women had to couch opinions in satire, it was perhaps the furthest she could go. 1815. Emma. Something's wrong. It's wrong in England's attitude toward women, but also in Austen. She'll soon start to feel seriously ill. But before her health declines, she has one more book to publish. Austen saw society wrestling with how women should be educated, and where women of independent means fit into society. In Emma, she created an independent, educated woman who, with nothing better to do, tries to match a friend of hers with a gentleman. But, in overestimating her own abilities, she nearly destroys many of the lives she set out to improve. It reads both like encouragement and caution. Be independent, but be careful how you use it. But even as her novel of independent women hit the stands, she began to lose her own independence. Illness took her ability to write. One of the last pieces we have from her is a note saying she was putting down her pen, for it had become too laborious. Yet, she still would continue scribbling a few lines with her pencil when she was able, even when bedridden. Jane died in her sister's arms in July 1817. Her sister and brother ensured her two unpublished novels, Persuasion and Northanger Abbey, reached the world under her name, and her work has never been out of print since. So who was she? She was a person who bucked the societal trends of the time and saw a new world dawning. She was a woman who looked on her world of dances and morning visits with fondness, but also knew it was fundamentally flawed. We know from her last completed work, Persuasion, that she was concerned about the future and about our responsibilities as writers and as people to use our powers of persuasion responsibly to shape that future. We also know she changed the nature of the novel forever, winning the medium respect and upping the ante for complex dialogue. And most of all, we know that she was a person who burned to write, who had to write, even though her name couldn't be on her work, even though her books brought her little success, even though her illness made it nearly impossible to hold a pen. Now, we may not know Jane Austen as well as we'd like to, but we do know she changed and challenged our world. And we're all better off for it.
Hi. Sexual energy is the link between the spirit world and the material world.
And that thought, I let it drift by like a cloud in the sky.
But when I look out the windshield and I'm looking at my future, the next 10, 20, 30 years, it's a little hazy.
And why do we want what we're supposed to have when getting it can make us feel so unhappy?
That's something that most of the adults in your life tell you. Well, you know what, sweetie? I know you like to pray to everything, but really we need to move along now. We need to get going with life and get on with things.
And you light up my world. I'm completely in love with you.
What has the power to raise a barn, literally or figuratively, feed our souls, help us find vitality, affect real big change?
Yeah, I'll call that genius. But it's genius that channels through you, and it is completely natural.
Every day I fall in love with you more and more, except yesterday. Yesterday you were pretty annoying.
Who would have thought? I could have so much shame and hidden messages wrapped up in shoes.
We make up stories. We're built to do so as humans, magically.
So traditionally, a hero is someone who exemplifies virtue, idealism, hope, and who is going to do anything to combat the forces of evil or some great obstacle in their life, in their journey.
What new way are we going to be with this? What is the next step?
And then I had this thought that changed everything for me.
The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution guarantees that no one shall be denied the right to vote based on gender. Why was this amendment necessary? How long did it take for it to become part of the Constitution? Throughout the early 1870s, the National Woman Suffrage Association attempted multiple legal challenges with the hope of gaining women the right to vote. They argued that women should have this right based on the 15th Amendment, which states that all citizens should have the right to vote. The Supreme Court heard 3 cases on this matter, the most famous being Minor versus Happersett. Each time they ruled that this amendment only referred to male citizens. After these defeats, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony tried a different approach. They authored a constitutional amendment which was introduced in the Senate by Aaron Sargent, a senator from California who was a strong advocate of women's suffrage. He formally introduced the measure in January of 1878. The Senate made no effort to act on the proposal until 9 years later. Finally, in 1887, the amendment was voted on and rejected by the Senate with a vote of 16 in favor and 34 opposed. Suffragists such as Carrie Chapman Catt then began to concentrate on a state-by-state effort to achieve suffrage. Many of the new western states, such as Wyoming, Utah, and Washington, were already allowing women to vote. Throughout the early 1900s, many more western states were added to this number, with 15 states eventually passing women's suffrage laws prior to 1920. However, despite these successes, the idea of a constitutional amendment would not go away. The amendment was proposed again in 1914, as well as 1915 and 1918. Each time, it failed to receive the required number of votes. The amendment was voted on again by the House of Representatives in February of 1919, and once again failed to pass, but only by 1 vote. On May 21st, 1919, the measure was voted on once more, finally receiving the necessary votes. It was then voted on by the Senate, who also approved the amendment after a lengthy discussion. This was only the first step in approving the new constitutional amendment. It had received the necessary 2/3 vote from both the House of Representatives and the Senate, but in order to become part of the Constitution, another step was necessary. 3/4 of the state legislatures needed to ratify the amendment. This could have been a lengthy process, with some amendments not being approved for years, if at all. The first 3 states to ratify the amendment were Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan. All 3 of these states did so on June the 10th, 1919. Over the course of the next year, states continually ratified the amendment, one at a time. A total of 36 states were needed in order for the amendment to become law. Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify, making the 19th Amendment official on August the 18th, 1920. The amendment reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." The amendment was not a popular one amongst some citizens. Many did not feel that women should be allowed to vote. It was immediately challenged in court. The Supreme Court case known as Lesser versus Garnett argued that this amendment took away a state's right to determine for itself whether women should vote. The Supreme Court dismissed this claim and upheld the amendment as being constitutional. Some states still refused to ratify the amendment, even though it was now law. Many southern states, such as South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, and North Carolina, did not ratify the amendment until the 1970s. Mississippi did not ratify it until March 22, 1984. Regardless of the protest against the amendment, the goal of the women's suffrage movement had been achieved. Women began voting immediately, and they soon became a powerful force in the world of politics.
Have you ever heard your mom, aunt, or grandma talk about going to vote in an election? Did you know that almost 100 years ago, women couldn't vote? There were some very strong, determined women who decided that women should be able to vote and have a say in their government. Before 1920, women weren't allowed to vote. They also weren't paid as much as men who did the same job as them, and they weren't allowed to speak in public meetings. There are many important women in the suffragette movement. These women knew that they were being treated unfairly, and they wanted women everywhere to have equal rights as men. One of these women is Susan B. Anthony. Susan was born to a family that encouraged her to be active in her community. She soon noticed how unfairly women were being treated, and she wanted to do something about it. Susan met Elizabeth Cady Stanton at the first Women's Rights Convention in 1851. Elizabeth shared Susan's same feelings. They decided to team up and work to get laws passed that would allow women to vote. 2 large groups pushed women's voting rights: the National Woman's Party, led by Alice Paul, and the National American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Carrie Chapman Catt. Soon, President Roosevelt agreed that women should have the chance to vote, and he supported their movement. After picketing the White House, marching in parades, putting up signs, and giving speeches, women were heard, and the 19th Amendment passed and was ratified in 1920. This amendment allowed women to vote in every election. Sadly, Susan B. Anthony didn't live to see this amendment pass, but it was still nicknamed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment.
Hey everybody, I'm Madeline Hilling and I'm director of the Nevada County Narrow Gauge Railroad and Transportation Museum. Our goal is to preserve and make available the transportation history of our wonderful Nevada County. It has a fabulous history in every category, including ours. Now, we have, for one thing, engine number 5. Engine number 5, we went after in 1985 from Universal Studios, where it had been sold to when the railroad stopped. This engine ran from 1876 to 1942, and we have it here. And it's our movie star. It was in all kinds of movies. Now, as I mentioned, we're a transportation museum. We have the oldest car, steam car, in Nevada County and perhaps in California. It's a 1901 Jeffrey Kit car. In Nevada City, for those who love airplanes, was Lyman Gilmore, who said he flew before the Wrights. Now, we have a live film of Lyman Gilmore with one of his early planes, far earlier than the normal ones being built at that time. Those are major places to visit. Now, our docents are all volunteers. We're all volunteer, and they take you on tours. I want to mention our rail bus, which runs between Nevada City, the Railroad Museum, and the Northern Queen Motel. A lot of people remember that. That the hours are mostly in the summer, but check with us for special times. We are open only on weekends now for the winter schedule, 10 to 4, free admission, and as I say, and we have also a wonderful gift shop where you find things that you will not see in any other place. We're located at number 5 Kidder Court, which is actually off of New Mohawk and also Gold Flat. You can just find Gold Flat and you will find us.
From the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, a new hero will emerge. One who is ready. One who makes sure their friends and family are set. And has the power to go at a moment's notice. This fire season, you're the hero. We are Ready Nevada County.
In 1949, Williams Stationery opened their doors to offer businesses a variety of office supplies. Today, 66 years later, they are in the same location at 112 West Main Street in historic downtown Grass Valley, where they continue to serve your home office and business needs, including janitorial supplies and break room essentials. A family-owned business with convenience, selection, and value in mind, at Williams Stationery, you'll find everything you need, from fun to furniture to functional.